In 2024, the Australia Institute is bringing some of the world's greatest thinkers to Australia to help celebrate our 30th anniversary. We're delighted to announce that José Ramos Horta, President of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Laureate, will be our guest in October. President Ramos Horta will be speaking at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday the 8th of October at 6 p.m, 25 years on from Timor-Leste's historic vote for independence. Tickets are on sale now from the Sydney Opera House or via the link in the episode description.
Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we explain just what the hell is going on in the economy. My name is Adam Gottschalk. I'm a research fellow at the Australia Institute, and joining me today is our senior economist Matt Grudnoff. Eleanor and Greg are taking a well-deserved break from podcasting this week. Welcome, Matt.
G'day, thanks for having me.
No worries. So, Matt, we've heard a lot of talk this week about industrial relations and productivity. There's been the coalition and lobby groups for big business, like the Business Council of Australia. They've been harping on about it and having a go at the government for making it worse.
There were pretty dire warnings from Brand Black and other business leaders last night.
The message from the BCA last night was pretty loud and clear that the government doesn't have an economic plan that's going to support productivity and support businesses of all sizes.
Yeah, we've seen the GDP numbers a couple of weeks ago did talk about productivity still being at pretty low levels compared to decade averages.
Appalling levels.
I mean, how do we get it back?
The government seems to have done everything in its power to bring productivity down.
This challenge didn't just arrive on the day that we were elected. This is a challenge of long standing, some decades.
That has to be our national obsession now for the next 10, 15 years.
Matt, I'm bored already. Why should I care about productivity? I mean, what even is it?
Yeah, look, just saying the word productivity, I can feel listeners' eyes glazing over.
Mine are glazing over.
Look, what I can tell you is productivity is really important. It's not important for the reasons you might think. It's actually really important because it's actually a big con. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean productivity itself is a con. Productivity is really important. I mean how it's being used at the moment is a big con. And there are a lot of people out there that are basically claiming that productivity is something that it's not. And they're doing that in order to try and further their own agenda. So what I really want to do is to highlight how important productivity is, but why it's important, and how we can bust some myths on what productivity isn't.
So why don't we start by talking about what productivity is, and then we can move on to chatting about some of the myths that surround it.
Yeah, so imagine that in a standard 8-hour shift, you and your colleagues at work produce 10 units of output. 10 units of stuff, whatever it is you produce. And let's say the organization you work for sends you all on a great training course. They rearrange how they run the business so that work flows a lot more smoothly. And they introduce some new equipment that makes you be able to do your job better. And then in that standard 8-hour shift, you and all your workers on average can now produce 11 units of stuff per day. So it's gone from 10 units of stuff per day to 11 units of stuff per day. Productivity has gone up by 10%. So it's really just at its kind of simplest way, the most simple way we measure labor productivity. It's just the amount of output a worker can produce in, say, an hour.
Right. Well, that sounds pretty simple. So how are people spinning this into something that it isn't?
Well, it's important to remember what productivity isn't. Productivity is nothing to do with profitability. What do I mean by that? Well, think back to, if you're old enough, to the mining boom in the noughties. During that time, prices for all the stuff we were digging up increased massively. And miners basically said, that's great. And they went on this great mining investment spree where they built more mines, they built bigger mines, and they expanded their existing mines. But what that meant is they had to dig deeper and further in order to extract the same amount of minerals because they were digging them in more remote and deeper places, which means the amount of output they got per hour of work went down because it was harder to dig that stuff up. So their productivity dropped quite dramatically. But at the same time, they were insanely profitable, right? They were super profitable because the price they were selling for it was so high. Now, if you think back even further, when I was a kid, in every suburb, there was a video rental store. And now they're all gone. Basically, streaming and other things basically wiped them out. Now, the very last video store to shut down was probably the most productive video store, right? It was able to keep its customers happy. It was really innovative. How do I know it was productive? Because it was the last one to get wiped out. But it wasn't profitable when it got wiped out, quite obviously. So you can be the most productive business producing something that nobody wants, and you won't make a profit. You could also be like a monopoly that's super inefficient, but because you're the only seller and you're able to sell it for a really high price, you can be super profitable. So productivity and profitability are different. And business in particular like us to think that those two things are the same thing, and that in order to improve productivity, we should be doing things that will actually just make them more profitable.
So why would businesses want us to think that?
They want us to think that because everybody knows that productivity is important and improving productivity is important. But if businesses went out there and said, well, I want these reforms because it will make me more profitable, that is a far less persuasive case than, oh, let's go out there because we want to improve productivity. So they mix the two. And because people don't really have a great grasp of what productivity is, people kind of get confused and think, well, yeah, if we make it easier for business, if we make it easier for them to make a profit, then perhaps productivity will go up. But the two are unrelated.
Okay, and what does any of this have to do with industrial relations? Because that seems to have been what's been in the news the last week or so.
Yeah, so what business are basically saying is that the recent changes that the government have introduced have basically closed some loopholes around labour hire companies. And it means that basically, in the long run, these businesses will have to pay their workers more. And so what they're effectively saying is by having to make us pay our workers more, you're going to reduce our productivity. But that's actually wrong. The reverse is true. If labor is really cheap, if wages are really, really low, then businesses aren't likely to introduce new equipment and machinery to make their workers more productive. They're not likely to send them on training courses to make them more productive because labor's cheap. They can just bring in more workers if they want to increase their output. On the other hand, if workers are really expensive, if it's a high-cost environment for hiring workers, then they're going to want to get the most out of every worker they have. They're going to give them the best machinery. They're going to want to train them to the best ability. They're going to organize their business so they can get the most out of their workers. So higher wages are actually linked with higher productivity, not lower productivity.
Right, so you're suggesting these industrial relations reforms that the coalition and big misses are crying about, actually, they're doing good things for productivity. They're not doing bad things for productivity.
Well, they're certainly not going to make it worse. And they're not linked particularly to productivity, and certainly not in the way that big business are talking about. What big businesses are interested in is driving down the cost of wages so they can drive up profits.
Right. Let's just take a step back and look at what's been happening to productivity in Australia over the last few decades. Why is everyone so concerned about it?
Yeah, so in the last few years, during the pandemic and then just after, productivity has been quite slow. In fact, in some years, it's actually gone backwards. Now, that's probably not something that we necessarily have to panic about. The pandemic in particular caused all kinds of ructions in the economy. And it might just be that those have some of the reasons why productivity might have gone down. So there was a period of time where workers were basically not having to work and still being paid. So the JobKeeper program. Now, if you think about that, if you're not having to produce output, but you're still getting paid, then the amount you're producing per hour is quite low, right? So there were all kinds of ructions. And the way we measure productivity have tried to account for those. So that's the most recent time. But if we go to about the decade before that, productivity has actually been quite lax and slow. And during that time, wages have been quite low, but profits have been quite strong, right? So we've come out of a period where we've had quite weak productivity growth, we've had quite strong profits growth, and wages have been particularly weak.
Right. So productivity's been on the down. Big businesses using productivity as an excuse to complain about policies that they see hurting their profits, essentially.
Exactly.
Right. So it's all a con.
To be really clear, productivity is not a con. Productivity is really important. We should be focused on trying to improve productivity. But there are a lot of people who are in this space claiming that they want to improve productivity when really all they're interested in is trying to improve their profitability.
Right. So, for instance, the head of the Business Council, he gave a speech at Parliament House recently. His name's Brand Black. And he said that the answer to all of our problems, that's the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, reaching net zero by 2050, improving aged care, all of it lay in increasing productivity. So when Brand Black is talking about increasing productivity, what kinds of things is he actually wanting the government to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, think back to my original definition of what productivity was. I talked about how the business you worked for trained your workers better, introduced new equipment, rearranged the business so it worked better. There are basically three actors on productivity. There's workers, there's business, and there's government. Workers probably have, surprisingly, the least amount to do with productivity. All a worker can really do is get a good education as they're growing up. And to be clear, Australians are getting more educated today than they have been ever. So workers are absolutely doing their best to improve productivity. And then there's the government, which receives by far most of the focus on productivity. And because they've been the focus, governments actually do think about productivity quite a bit. So they have some influence, but it's still actually only fairly small. They can really change laws, but there's not a great deal, despite what some people might think, there's not a great deal of red tape in the country. But by far the biggest actor on productivity is the business. They're the ones who decide how the business is organised. They're the ones that decide how much training their workers are going to get. They're the ones who decide what equipment and machinery the workers will interact with. So when you have big business complaining and saying productivity is weak, it needs to be improved, it's a bit like if I was a kid and I was telling my parents, my room is messy, you need to clean it up. You know, my parents are going to turn around and tell me, yeah, your room is messy and you need to clean it up. And this is exactly the same situation. Big business are the ones who can improve productivity. And we've seen over the last decade or more, businesses have invested tiny amounts per year on average into their businesses. And investments, buying new equipment and machinery, they're the kind of things that will improve productivity. And it's actually business that's letting us down and not investing.
Yeah, I wish I had the guts to tell my parents that when I was a kid. So we've talked about how workers are doing their bit to boost productivity, but I'm interested in finding out how the fruits of that productivity, how income has been distributed between workers and then small businesses and big businesses.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've said that business has been really profitable. I should specify that big business is the one that are making money. So you can break the economy down into three broad groups: large businesses, small businesses, and workers. And you can look at all of the income that's earned and where it's flowing from. So how much of all of the income is flowing from wages? How much is it coming from small business profits? And how much is it going to big business profits? Now, the share of total income going to wages and small business profits has been going down over the last decade or so. The share of income going to big business has been going up. And the reason is because Australia has turned into a country of large, lazy, big businesses, what economists would call oligopolies. So an oligopoly is a few firms dominating a market. So think 2 big supermarkets, 2 big airlines, a couple of large telcos, 4 big banks. All of our big industries are dominated by a few players, and these players are not investing. Why? Because they don't have to. They can sit back and use their market power and their market share to rake in big profits.
So big business has been complaining about various policies that they claim are dampening their productivity. Why are they making such a big fuss all of a sudden about these? I mean, some of these industrial relations reforms, for instance, they were passed like a year or two ago. Why are the coalition and businesses suddenly piling on?
Yeah, it's a great question. You may have noticed, but we're coming up on an election,
yeah,
right? And so despite the fact that these industrial relations changes have already happened, I think big business are signalling to the Labor Party, you need to stop, you need to not go further. So think back to before the pandemic, we had a decade where workers just couldn't get pay rises. And that was because the industrial relations system was rigged against workers in favour of businesses. And business, particularly big business, is really worried that the Labor Party might go to the next election saying, well, we're going to go further. We're actually going to make changes that will allow workers to get reasonable pay rises. And they don't want that to happen, because if that happens, then that's going to dig in their decades-long big profits. Okay, they'll have to actually start sharing some of their profits with their workers, and they don't want to do that. And so I think that they're hammering the Labor Party right now and using productivity as the cover for this hammering in order to basically warn the Labor Party off about going further and making more changes to industrial relations that's going to make it better for workers and them slightly less profitable.
Yeah, and the coalition, of course, is picking up on all of this and signalling that they're going to go to the election doing what business wants. I mean, on the weekend, we had the Shadow Finance Minister, Senator Jane Hume, talking on Insiders.
And the first step would be making sure that we have a productive economy that has an industrial relations system that is flexible not just for employees but also for employers, that we have lower energy costs,
does that mean
we
you get
have
rid of
cut red tape and regulation, and that we have lower and simpler, fairer taxes. This is
saying she's going to take a productivity agenda to the next election, which, according to her, meant removing red tape and regulation, lowering taxes, and then repealing some of those industrial relations reforms.
Yeah, and to be clear, that means that workers will have lower wages, which has nothing to do with productivity. So, the coalition are not beyond using productivity as cover for trying to make business more profitable, which unfortunately, I mean, that's a problem, but it's actually more unfortunate from that, in that actually could make productivity worse. It might actually make the situation worse.
So if that could make the situation worse, what are some of the actual solutions to boost productivity that the government could consider?
Yes, that's a great question. Why has productivity been so bad, and what can we do about it? Well, the big thing that hasn't been talked about very much is the reason that big businesses in particular are not investing and are not being productive is because of a lack of competition. They're huge, fat, lazy oligopolies. They don't have to invest. If you're a CEO on 7-figure salary and you have a choice between just sitting back and using your market power to bring in a big profit and make your shareholders happy and get a big bonus, or you could take a risk and innovate, right? And if that pays off, you'll make an even bigger profit. But if it fails, it might wipe out a huge part of that profit. Then all your shareholders get angry at you. You don't get your big bonuses. What are you going to do? Well, at the moment, they're sitting back and taking the safe option because they know that that's going to make them a lot of money and keep their shareholders happy. So it's this lack of competition that's actually driving the lack of productivity. They don't want to invest. While big business lobby groups might be calling for the government to make life easier for them, if we want to improve productivity, we need to be doing the opposite. Competition doesn't make things easier for them. Competition makes businesses work harder, innovate more. It means that if businesses are not working harder to lower their prices and make their customers happy, then they get hammered by their competition who are.
Right. So what could the government do to, increase competition?
Yeah. So we had a bit of discussion around grocery prices and competition reforms, but I don't think that goes nearly far enough. I think we need to look at divestiture powers. So the problem in Australia is we already have these big oligopolies. We can talk about merger powers and not making things worse, but the point is things are bad now. The government needs to be able to step into markets that they know are not working, be able to break firms up, create more competitors, and then that will inject more competition into the market. So imagine if we broke Coles and Woolies up into multiple entities, we could have 5, 6, 7 supermarkets all competing in order to try and lower grocery prices. We could break the banks up. We could break these big oligopolies up in order to have more competition in the market. And if they were having to compete, then they are going to innovate, they are going to invest, and therefore we are going to see more productivity.
Hold on, Matt, take a step back. You're talking about breaking up big companies. That sounds a lot like communism to me.
Yeah, look, we've heard that. In fact, even the Prime Minister has mentioned that. Look, there are a number of countries that have divestiture powers, such communist nations as the United States of America, as the United Kingdom. They all have divestiture powers.
Very communist.
Yeah, very communist. The United States has used those to break up. The classic example was Standard Oil, where they broke it up. And that created innovation. And in fact, even more recently, back in the late 90s, early noughties, around that period, I'm not sure of the exact date, the competition watchdog in the US forced Microsoft to break up its web search and Internet Explorer, its web browser, from its operating system. And that actually allowed the space for people like Google, who were actually innovative and young and quite productive at the time, to come into the market and innovate. And unfortunately, they've then become a monopoly. And I think the US has to do that again, basically, and break it up. But we know that when this happens, what we have is a wave of innovation behind that when those big companies are broken up, because new companies can come in and basically innovate, and there's space for them to take up some of the market share. So this kind of reform will absolutely make our economy more productive.
Okay, Matt, you've defended yourself. What do you reckon the chances of the government taking any of this kind of competition reform to the next election are?
Normally, I would be fairly pessimistic. But the fact is, we have a cost of living crisis at the moment, and consumers are concerned about the price of stuff. And one of the advantages of competition is it lowers prices, right? More competition means lower prices. And I think right now, politicians in particular are very sensitive to that. And I think they can be persuaded right now that competition is a good thing and real competition reform is a good thing. And not only will that lower prices, but it'll also make the Australian economy more productive. Productivity will grow faster, and we'll actually all benefit from that.
Right. But it takes us as consumers first to realize that lack of competition is part of the problem, and then to tell our politicians that we want more competition.
That's exactly right. So, now is the time with an election coming up when politicians are most sensitive to what people have to say. So I really encourage people to get out there and tell their politicians that what they want is more competition and an economy that works better for consumers and better for workers.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for chatting with me, Adam. It's always great to talk productivity.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Dollars and Cents. This episode of Dollars and Cents was recorded on Wednesday, 18th September, and some things may have changed since then. You can find Greg's column, Grogonomics, on the Guardian Australia site. And for more research, go to our website, which is at australiainstitute.org.au. Matt's Twitter handle is at Matt Grudnoff, and mine is at Adam Chalks It Up. Our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. See you next week.